Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth State of Infrastructure and Engagement presentation of results and panel discussion. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. My name is Kirsty O'Connell. I'm the Industry Director for the Institute for Infrastructure in Society and our flagship research program, the Next Generation Engagement Research Program, which so many of you are familiar with. This morning, we love questions. Please ask as many as you like, but please use the Q&A function for all of our participants so that we can keep a track of the questions. And it certainly helps us as we shape future surveys as well to know where your interest is. So that would be perfect for us if you don't mind. We have a large group this morning and a very diverse group. So really exciting to see so much interest from right across the infrastructure sector, as well as the community engagement sector in this work. This morning we'll be presenting to you the results from our industry-facing survey, which is now in its fourth year, heading into the fifth. And that is the State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey. Now, this survey we believe to be unique in Australia and more broadly in tracking the experiences of infrastructure professionals, particularly with regard to project delays, stakeholder pressure, and other factors surrounding community engagement, social licence, and social risk. This year, we did deep dives with our participants in the areas of resilience, digital engagement, and cumulative impacts. And we have some really fascinating insights from that work. What we are going to be able to do for you today, which I'm really excited about, is couple that with some insights from our community-facing research series, which started this year, which is Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure. And combined, it gives us that 360-degree view of the experiences of some of our most impacted community members, together with very experienced industry professionals in the infrastructure sector. So a really nice data set to be able to draw on. I cannot go any further without thanking our wonderful industry supporters. We are so privileged to have the support of 3 state governments in the Queensland government, the South Australian government, and the Victorian government, all through their leading transport agencies, together with IAP2, Lend-Lease and Transurban, and a variety of fantastic consultancies and civil society groups and membership organisations. And I know we have GHD and Oricon represented in the audience, together with Melbourne Water, who are supporting partners on a number of our key projects. This morning we have a very experienced panel. Oh, and I'm sorry, thanks, Sarah. For those of you who are interested in our work and who would like to be able to see more of what we've done recently, can I just encourage you to use the little QR code on this slide? If you take a quick snapshot of it, it will take you directly to our annual report. And we've gone to the trouble of actually compiling all of our recent presentations and reports that you're able to access. So it gives you a nice concise summary of some of the things that we've been working on, together with a broader snapshot of the team that we've assembled at ANU within the Institute. This morning we have an extremely experienced research panel to present to you, led by Professor, and I'm sorry, Sarah, I'm skipping ahead, skipping right on through. Just to put a little bit of the work from this morning in context, what we are actually seeing is a continued effort by federal government and by state governments to invest in infrastructure as part of the post-pandemic recovery. We know that infrastructure was already key to our economy and to the development of our society prior to COVID, but that has only increased. We have 17.9 billion in additional spending, and we're now at a total pipeline of infrastructure projects of approximately $290 billion in Australia. Now, this is unprecedented, and it creates some really interesting pressures, both for impacted communities and also for the industry. Now, those pressures include a real concentration of projects in the rail sector. So we know that that sector in particular has huge demand at this point in time right across the country. We also know that we are building bigger and more complex projects in a much more constrained environment So what we're hearing from our partners at Infrastructure Australia is that where previously communities may have only had one mega project, one project greater than $1 billion in, say, a 5-kilometre radius, now it is not uncommon to see as many as 2 or even 3 of those mega projects in that constrained environment. So we have communities that are experiencing much bigger, much more complex projects in a much closer proximity to their homes. When you couple that with the pandemic effect of people living, working, playing, and even educating their children differently, it makes for a really interesting background to the results that we're presenting today. Now, one of the things that we're really excited to be able to do today is to also have the insights of a very experienced industry professional in Romina Cavallo from GHD. So we will be able to present to you not only the academic insights and the thorough research grounding for our comments, but to have Romina then also offer her thoughts as a practitioner in terms of the practical implications of these findings for our work. Romina is the business group leader of engagement, communication and communities at GHD. For the research team, we have Professor Sarah Bice, who is the director of the Institute for Infrastructure and Society, the immediate past president of the International Association for Impact Assessment, which is the world's peak body for impact assessment professionals, and certainly one of the most sought after researchers and authors in the social license space. She's joined by Dr. Emerson Sanchez, who is an I2S research fellow and who brings a wealth of experience in understanding community conflict in complex infrastructure environments. So without further ado, I would love to hand over to this very experienced panel to begin sharing with you the results from the 4th State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Kirsty, and welcome everyone. It is wonderful to have you with us here today as we are excited to launch our 4th annual State of Infrastructure and Engagement report. Many of us are coming from many different spaces and places today, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where I'm broadcasting from, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging wherever you may be coming to us from today. We have been doing the survey since 2018, collecting data between 2017 and 2021. So it's really exciting to be able to now start to see genuinely some emerging trends. And we're really looking forward, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, to launching the 5th State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey very soon. So please watch out for that. But first, who responded during the height of the pandemic? Let's have a look at our survey respondents for the years 2020 to 2021. What we can see here on the left is that we have very experienced professionals participating in the survey. This year we had around about 127 industry professionals commenting on social risk, social license, how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted their infrastructure practice, including in relation to digitization and dealing with communities who were very much under pressure in an unprecedented situation. And you can see on the right, we've got a really, really nice mix of the different sectors. And indeed, those percentages there really do overlap nicely with the current project pipeline throughout Australia. So we can see all of those sectors here represented in the research results. Survey respondents also demonstrate a really good mix of the types of organizations that we normally see within major projects. We've got project developers and operators at the top of the list, with 35% of respondents identifying as being with a project developer or operator. But we also have a good representation from our major contractors in the industry, as well as our consulting and advisory firms and government. So the reason we present the survey respondents data to start with is to really give you an assurance and a sense that this is the fulsome and robust picture. This picture is genuinely representative, and we can see that reflected in the participants who gave their expertise, time, and knowledge to the survey. And if you were one of these people, please let us say thank you. It is incredibly important that people like yourselves volunteer your time and expertise for research like this, because it does allow us to provide you with insights into the sector in which you're working and to really give you some robust data, which we hope will inform your day-to-day practice. Survey respondents also perform a variety of roles within their projects. The majority of our respondents are team members or senior managers, and we also have a good mix of managers. Unsurprisingly, given the focus of our survey, the majority of our respondents at 40% sat in community stakeholder engagement. We also have a really great representation from project management teams, as well as engineering and design. So again, it's really nice to see in this survey that the results represent not just community engagement professionals, but the aligned disciplines that need to be on board to make our projects happen. The other thing that I think is really important to share is the length of time that our respondents have been involved in the infrastructure sector. So the average amount of time that a respondent has been involved in the sector was 12.4 years. And what that tells us is that this data is not just from anyone. This is experienced industry professionals who are sharing their genuine insights. So, what did that group of widely representative and quite experienced professionals have to tell us about the status of projects in the year 2020? And my goodness, what a year that was. What we see in 2020 is not at all surprising, but I think it's really, really helpful to put some figures around it, and also in our next survey to start to track whether and how this situation is changing across 2021. 58% of respondents to the survey experienced at least one project that was delayed. And they also were experiencing, at least 8% of our respondents were experiencing projects that were delayed indefinitely, with 5% experiencing projects being canceled. This information is interesting, but it's much more useful when we start to put it in context. So if we look at the data that we have collected between 2018 and 2021, this is how we see projects going. So what we can see is a substantial decline in our respondents experiencing projects that are underway, on budget, on schedule, within scope. And similarly, if we look at the number of respondents who reported experiencing a project completed on time and on budget in 2020, we have a 75% decrease since 2018, or a 57 percentage point drop. What we want to do then is understand what are some of the factors that are contributing to increased experiences of delay, even beyond the obvious of the pandemic, and how are stakeholder pressures and community pressures in particular playing a role in project status and outcomes. And so we turn now to have a quick look at stakeholder pressure. Year on year, the State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey measures the major influences on project delay according to industry professionals' experiences. And year on year, you can see towards the left-hand side of the graph that industry professionals tell us that project funding, stakeholder and community pressure, and regulatory and planning issues, which can be associated with things like ministerial decisions and policy backflipping, are the top 3 most impactful factors to project delays, cancellations, mothballing, or delivery, but not as originally intended. In 2020, the number 1 most impactful factors, tied for first place, according to our respondents, were project funding and regulatory and planning issues at 24%, followed closely by stakeholder and community pressure. So this graph tells us a number of things. It tells us that project funding, stakeholder and community pressure, and regulatory and planning issues are consistently the most impactful factors affecting on time, on budget project delivery. It also starts to reveal a picture in which, and we combine this with our other data, and we'll talk more about this throughout the conversation today and in our report to follow. But this also shows us that these three issues are tightly and unsurprisingly perhaps interconnected and interrelated. And in 2022, as we enter an announceables election cycle, I think we're going to see very clearly how regulatory and planning issues, and particularly the potential politicization of those issues, starts to relate to stakeholder and community pressure, and indeed stakeholder and community expectations about infrastructure and what it delivers, and obviously project funding. So we're entering a phase here where I think these three factors will not only maintain their level of influence, but that interaction or intersection between them will become even more apparent. And it's something we can all watch out for, and we'll probably see it in our daily news reports. We also ask our participants year on year, can you tell us about the degree to which adverse stakeholder pressure played a role in delays or cancellations that you experienced? And so this captures projects between 2018 and 2020. And what we can see this past survey, so looking at projects that were being delivered in 2020, is that we had an increase in the number of participants who were saying that stakeholder pressure affected their projects only to a limited degree. So that went up this year to 36%. And we also, on the right-hand side of the graph, see a slight but notable decline in the number of respondents who reported that adverse stakeholder pressure played a great deal of influence or a good deal of influence. So if you look at those orange bars on the right, you can see they're going down just slightly in those two categories. And later on, when we talk about our insights and interpretation of this data, I'll come back to this to give what I think is an explanation of why we see an increase in industry professionals saying, look, it played a limited degree and a bit of a decrease in that adverse stakeholder pressure being so influential. So listen out for that. And I really do invite your questions in the Q&A. We again asked, to what extent do you agree or disagree? Social risks played a major role in the progress or outcomes of projects I worked on in 2020. And what we can see here is 42% of participants agreed or strongly agreed that yes, this was the case. And interestingly, we have a pretty even split here across the categories. So that agree, strongly agree is decidedly out the front. We've got about 26% of respondents who are neutral on that idea, and a further 32% who disagree or strongly disagree. So these two graphs that I've just shown you, they give us an important insight into what was happening in 2020 around stakeholder pressure. And I will come back to this in our insights, but we think that there is something explainable happening here, but also very important. So again, if we look at in 2020, management of social risks played a major role. This is just a bit more of a breakdown of a similar idea, played a role in related to community acceptance, stakeholder relations, or social license to operate. So really starting to get into some of those more granular issues around stakeholder pressure. And here we had 51.5% of agree or strongly agree. And so you can kind of see that bar spread out here. We had more in the agreement section around stakeholder relations, social license to operate. We're very interested too to understand the media through which you may most commonly receive stakeholder pressure or experience stakeholder pressure. And so year on year, we ask this question: what types of stakeholder pressure did you experience on projects you were delivering in 2020? Now, unsurprisingly, given that many of us were certainly here in Melbourne in lockdown and living our lives through the internet, 47% of respondents said, look, the most we experienced was in social media. So there was a lot of online engagement throughout 2020. 41% though said we're still experiencing more traditional kind of stakeholder pressure through petitions, or that 39% in lobbying and 37% in mainstream media. So you've got that pretty common mix of stakeholder pressure being experienced through those types of media. We then go on to ask a further question, because we're not just interested in the quantity or volume of media through which people experienced pressure. We also want to know, okay, maybe you experienced a lot of this, but how impactful was it? And so what's interesting here is that, and this proves to be the case so far year on year with this question, what is the case is that the majority of stakeholder pressure experience occurred through social media. But when we ask what was most impactful, only 9% of respondents reported that the social media stakeholder pressure was most impactful. And indeed, and this is reflected year on year. So these results are the 2021 results. But year on year, what we see is that social media makes up the bulk of stakeholder pressure via a particular medium, but it's the least impactful. And what remain the most impactful forms of media for stakeholder pressure are the more traditional ones. So petitions, 21%, lobbying, 11%, and then mainstream media tied with social media. So something to keep in mind for you and your teams when you're experiencing a large volume of social media, taking that moment to check, okay, we're getting a lot of this, but is it the most impactful? Because what our data shows is the most impactful media are the more traditional ones. I'm going to hand over now to my very good colleague, Dr. Emerson Sanchez. Each year, we take a number of deep dives into a variety of themes or cross-cutting issues that we know are affecting the sector, and they're kind of our hot button issues. In our 5th annual survey, we'll be looking at the politicization of projects as we're in an election year. But this year, we took some different deep dives. Emerson, would you like to tell us about those, please?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sarah. Each year, in consultation with our Research Advisory Board, we dig deep into current issues of major importance for the infrastructure sector. In the previous survey, we focused on social risk, how it is identified, assessed, and managed. This year, we specifically looked at the impact of COVID-19 to infrastructure projects and community engagement. The other issues we looked at this year is the perspectives of industry professionals on the relationship between digital technology and project delivery and community engagement. So we collected a lot of rich data on industry issues related to COVID-19 and digital technology. Today, we will present some highlights on these issues, but we will have other webinars and deep dive reports that would capture all the rich findings from these questions. So we found interesting findings on the deep dive into the impact of COVID-19 to community engagement. We say that because in one of our earlier questions on factors that affected project delivery, COVID-19 did not figure prominently as one of the reasons. But when asked directly, we see in this slide that COVID-19 was actually deemed influential to project outcomes. So we asked this question to our respondents. Thinking of all the projects that were delayed, canceled, mothballed, or not completed as planned in 2020, how influential was the COVID-19 pandemic to these outcomes? When we looked at the responses, 61% of our respondents thought that the pandemic influenced these project delays, cancellations, mothballing, and uncompletion. So for us, this means that many of our infrastructure sector professionals witnessed how the pandemic affected project delivery in 2020. In the next slide, the other question about the pandemic that we asked is this: which, if any, of the following community engagement issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic did the projects also experience in 2020? For industry professionals, the top issue for them was the shift to digital engagement. So 25% of respondents selected this issue. And if we look at the other top issues, we can infer that these are also related to the shift to digital engagement. For example, the second top issue is reduced interaction with community members, and the fourth top issue is reduced interactions with community engagement staff. These issues of reduced interactions in one way or another could be related to the shift to digital engagement. And speaking of digital engagement, we move on to our deep dive into the perspectives of industry professionals on the impact of digital technology to project delivery and community engagement. One of the questions we ask community engagement professionals is this: thinking about the shift to remote and digital technologies, please tell us your opinion about some of the common issues attached to digital and technology and engagement. We see that the respondents have a positive perception on digital technology. The blue bars on the slide represent different degrees of agreement. This is overwhelming acknowledgement of the advantages of digital technologies on all the issues represented in the survey. If you look at the third issue from the top, this acknowledgement is highest among engagement professionals on increasing opportunities for citizen participation, which is almost 86% agreeing on this point. This is followed by the second issue from the top, which is the belief that digital technologies are improving collaboration between project disciplines. Then if you look at the bottom of the list, this is followed by improving relationships between major projects and communities. One thing I will note, though, is the fourth issue from the top. The opinion of engagement professionals is almost split on the issue of whether artificial intelligence technologies will replace certain human interactions with community members. I say that the opinion is split because if we add all the orange bars signifying those who disagree, that would total about 44%, while those who agreed, represented by the blue bars, would total 47% of respondents. In the next slide, another question we ask community engagement professionals is about their perspective on the influence of digital engagement to project delivery in the future. We ask them, we'd like you to think about how the accelerated use of digital technologies may affect stakeholder pressure on projects. Please tell us your opinion about some of the common issues attached to digital technology and stakeholder pressures. If you look at the second issue from the top, among the issues we listed, the one that garnered the highest number of agreement from engagement professionals was on misinformation or disinformation on social media affecting project delivery. If we add all the blue bars, this represents 86% of respondents who agreed on this issue. If you look at the third issue from the top, this is the second top issue, which is the silent majority will start to be more vocal about major projects through digital technologies. This was followed by the first issue on the list, the increased use of digital technology resulting in more community oppositions to major projects. Taken together, the data on the deep dive into digital engagement suggests some ambivalence on the pros and cons of digital technology and project delivery. In a separate deep dive report, we will explain this ambivalence further. But for now, what I can say is that some of the explanations given by our respondents reflect the double-edged sword of digital technology. For example, it can provide opportunities for citizen participation while potentially being dominated by skilled and well-resourced opposition groups. And now, I'll hand over the presentation back to Sarah, who will continue the discussion on cumulative impacts.
Thanks so much, Emerson. That was a really terrific summary of some very, very fascinating data, and we appreciate your work analyzing all of the survey data that we're presenting here today and really giving us some clear insights into what is happening in the sector relative to these deep dive issues. Kirsty mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that we're really pleased today to bring you some unique insights by combining major surveys that we've run with the Australian public with the survey that we're presenting today, where the respondents are all infrastructure industry professionals. The Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure series of surveys involved a national survey of approximately 3,500 Australians from every state and territory. And we then ran a further 9 surveys in infrastructure intensive communities in metro, regional, and rural areas of Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria, with South Australian surveys in metro and regional areas currently underway. So we'll soon be able to present 11 communities survey responses. For today, we've got 9, and it's really helpful because what we're able to do when we start to think about the cumulative impacts of projects, and Kirsty mentioned that data from Infrastructure Australia, which is looking at the now Venn diagram of overlaps of projects, and we have about 39% of communities, according to Infrastructure Australia, who have a mega project within their area, have another mega project within 5 kilometres, and a whopping 91% of Australian communities who have a mega project in their area will have another mega project within 200 kilometres. So this is something real. We know that we are in the most intensive infrastructure environment in Australian history. We can see more investments being made. We now have an estimated $290 billion infrastructure pipeline with the recent budget announcements by the Commonwealth Government. And so we asked in the State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey for infrastructure professionals, how well do you think your organization is aware of cumulative project impacts? Is it considering those impacts? How well is it managing those impacts? And is community opposition being driven more today by the layered experience of multiple projects at once, as opposed to concerns about the impact of an individual project? So here's some data from our cumulative effects questions from our community engagement professionals within the survey. And what we want to look at are these yellow bars, because most community engagement professionals somewhat agree with the majority of questions that we asked about cumulative impacts. And that includes somewhat agreeing that yes, community opposition today is driven less by concern about one particular project and more by concerns about the impacts of multiple projects being delivered in that one geographic area. What's really interesting here is that community engagement professionals are also pretty firm to say, look, I feel pretty good about this. My organization is collaborating with other organizations delivering projects in an area, and we're all trying collaboratively to reduce negative impacts. Similarly, the majority of professionals, and you can see that high bar over on the right-hand side, second from the right, my organization considers other projects being delivered in a geographic region when taking decisions about project selection, planning, and delivery. So what we're seeing here from the professionals is that these issues are top of mind and that there is consideration being put into cumulative project effects. Indeed, we can see we've got over 50% of community engagement professionals within our respondent group saying, look, I do agree a bit, somewhat agree that a place-based approach to infrastructure will improve the likelihood that projects are delivered on time and on budget. And we hope for those of you who took the survey and somewhat agreed with that, you did that partly based on the knowledge that yes, stakeholder and community pressure is one of the major influences to project delay. So having this community-centric place-based approach, the data tells us it will make a difference to project delays and cancellations, ideally in a good way. So that's what the professionals tell us. Professionals in the sector are saying, look, we're aware of cumulative effects, and we think that we're doing a pretty good job collaborating with other developers who are delivering in parallel. We think we're doing a pretty good job in our organizations of being aware of cumulative effects. And we do agree that there is value in considering a place-based approach to infrastructure. So what then happens when we look at data from the local community members who are in these intensive infrastructure communities? So here we have the 9 communities in Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria represented. And this is a model of what drives trust in infrastructure developers to act responsibly, and relatedly then, what drives acceptance of major projects. Now, what's interesting is community members are saying that their trust in government is the #1 driver of trust in the project overall. And that's followed closely by transparency, really being able to see and access what is going on in their local area. Number three, that they feel that there is response to their feedback. Now, that doesn't mean that the developer or government has to agree with their position, but what it means is that there is a sense that there is responsiveness. They are being heard and they are being respectfully engaged. And then fourth, we see that this is all backed up by a reliance on the formal structure of regulation. And so the degree to which our community members trust our regulation and enforcement of that regulation is really driving their trust in developers to act responsibly to deliver projects. What then drives acceptance from a community member's perspective where they are experiencing cumulative project effects? We can see very strongly that first, they're really interested in, does our community need this development? So if there is a perception that the development being delivered isn't really needed by the community, that is going to lower their acceptance. We also see on the flip side of that coin, if communities believe that projects are beneficial, and this is our 0.27, this is our highest driver there. If communities believe that projects are beneficial, they are much more likely to accept developments. So a place-based approach, a human-centered approach, a values-based approach to infrastructure delivery is, the data shows us, these are not soft and fuzzy ideas. The data shows us that these things are the measurable components that can improve acceptance of projects and that play a role in the degree to which community members trust projects. So again, let's link up the data with the survey of professionals who say, look, we're aware of cumulative impacts. We are acknowledging that they're an issue to be addressed, and community members who say in places where they're experiencing lots of projects, we need trust, we need regulation, and we really need to understand how these projects are beneficial. For those of you working in intensive infrastructure environments, this graph is incredibly helpful because these communities are demonstrating what we call a threshold effect. So once communities get to a point where they are experiencing 4 to 6 projects or 6 or more projects, and you can see in the orange bars on all of the graphs, we start to see a decline. We see a decline in agreement that infrastructure developers operate in a transparent way. We see a decline in agreement that regulations ensure infrastructure developers do the right thing. Okay, transparency was the second driver in trust. Regulation was the fourth driver of trust. And where you have multiple projects, you see these communities starting to show a decrease. My community has generally had positive relationships with developers. We see a decline. And really importantly, when we know that understanding and believing that a project is beneficial will lead to community acceptance, where communities have 6 or more projects in the one area, they start to lose the plot a bit. And by that, I mean very respectfully to communities, it's really difficult for them to see the overall collective planning picture. And so where communities experience 6 or more projects, their level of agreement that there's a good overall planning for the future of my community declines steeply. And you can see that on the far right. So what we have here is a situation in which community members who are genuinely experiencing cumulative project impacts are showing declines in the measures that are most likely or most strongly influential to their trust in projects and to their acceptance of projects. Also, fortunately, we see an infrastructure sector, at least amongst the community engagement profession, that demonstrates an awareness of the importance of cumulative impacts. And if you are one of those professionals in the room today, we really encourage you, and you are welcome to use this data to go back to your teams and explain that yes, cumulative effects do matter. And certainly where communities are experiencing 4 to more than 6 projects, they are having a manifest effect on the factors that research shows drive their trust and acceptance of infrastructure projects. And we know from our own research that that then influences the level of stakeholder pressure, which is a major influence on project delay. So you can start to see a lot of these things coming together in the light bulb, some insights. And I'm very conscious of time, and I want us to have enough time to have a good discussion and some Q&A. And we hope that showing you this data will really start to get you going and have some questions and also some comments. But what is the picture here? What is the picture that we can see from the research this year, noting that the data was collected on projects being delivered during an extraordinary time in all of our experiences? We're definitely seeing a buildup of delays, or at least a reporting of experiences of delays. Now, that is combined with a pandemic-associated increase in fast tracking, in project ramp-ups, and indeed in project investment. So we got the delays kind of building in the background. At the same time, we're seeing that fast tracking and that ramp up. And I'm going to go back to it now. We had those slides about stakeholder pressure and the extent to which it played a role in 2020. And what we saw from our respondents was a slight decline in respondents agreeing or strongly agreeing that stakeholder pressure played a major role on project outcomes in 2020. Our interpretation of these results is to say that that does not mean that stakeholder pressure, that stakeholders are happy, that stakeholders are going away and they're not going to have anything to say about projects. We have to take those results within the context of a once-in-a-generation pandemic. And our interpretation is that stakeholders were so fatigued, distracted, otherwise occupied during the pandemic that it is very likely that that reported decline in the amount in which stakeholder pressures played a role reflected a public incapacity to participate in infrastructure design, delivery, comment to a normal level. And similarly, and we'd be really interested to hear from some of you today, we predict that what we were also seeing was infrastructure professionals and governments themselves just going to the fundamentals, making sure that the technical things were in place, making sure that where construction sites were being shut down, if we look at the New South Wales examples, that was being done in an efficient and safe way. So people were really fatigued and somewhat distracted. And we also had cumulative impacts happening. So this, we think, and I've put here this little sailboat now, it could be, headed into a perfect storm, or this could be a lovely moment of inflection and actually the clouds are going to clear and the storm will go away. So I take a really positive picture of this data to say, look, what we have now is a snapshot of a point in time that was a very, very unique point in time for all of us in all aspects of our lives, but particularly when we look at project delivery. And now we have a chance to understand these factors and hopefully to do something about them in our future practice. So very quickly before I hand over to Kirsty and we'll hear from Ram, some recommendations. If you're practicing community engagement, where can you focus based on the results of what we see here? I would say please expect a return of stakeholder pressure, and you may experience a likely increase. So we think that people were fatigued, they were distracted. What's likely to happen now as life continues to return more to what we knew as normal, people are going to go, oh, that thing's happening near me? Oh, wait, there's that thing too? And we expect that people are going to increase that pressure, that they're going to come back on stream as they're able to have more capacity and as that fatigue reduces. The other thing, and Emerson's data around digitization really shows this, we encourage you to reflect and identify who's been engaged over the past couple of years, who's been silent or inadvertently left out. We know that digital technologies can enhance reach in terms of numbers, but is that enhancing your reach in terms of the diversity of populations? Are there vulnerable or marginalized communities? Is it increasing the capacity for those minority but really well, I suppose, supported voices to come through? And we encourage you always, but certainly now, don't let your guard down, really double down on engagement quality, because we do think that stakeholder pressure is likely to bounce back post-pandemic. So if you want to know more about our research, you can scan the code here. We'll put that up again later, but for now, I'm going to stop the share so that you can see the lovely panel that we have here for you today and hand over to Kirsty O'Connell. Kirsty.
There are some fantastic insights there. And as a practitioner, I think it really, when I first saw the data, really got me thinking, okay, what does this mean for projects that I'm on? You know, how can I apply this straight away? And we're really fortunate to have Romina Cavallo with us. Romina, you've been on so many projects, more than I've had hot dinners, I think. So, Rom, what were you struck by when you heard this data, and when you couple that with what we're hearing from our most impacted infrastructure intensive communities, you know, where we're hearing from them that, you know, it's really important to them that representative samples of their community are consulted, that they're brought into the consultation early enough to affect the result. You know, we're hearing that they really want regular communication, and they want to be able to know how they've influenced the outcome. You know, that's what some of our most impacted communities are saying. And then in the light of what you've heard from industry today, what do you think? What's it bringing to mind for you as a practitioner?
One of the things I've always been really passionate about is the data capture. And, you know, that concept now that we should all be more familiar with, which is social listening. And how many times, you know, we're talking about lifting the narrative of engagement, and our communities have come to us and they've lifted that narrative around strategic conversations. But we collect a lot of data, but what do we actually do with it? And that helps us to lift the quality of our engagement. Because when we walk into a community, this is the first time we've engaged with them on this project, we really have that assumption that they've never spoken about anything in their community ever before. And that's around that level of lifting our quality of engagement, is going to, you know, starting the conversations with, this is everything that we have heard before. As engagement professionals, we capture so much data, but who's listening and what are we doing with it? And, you know, to me, one of the trends in the future, you know, Sarah, you're talking about lifting that you know, we have to lift our game with engagement. This is one of the things that can really demonstrate that we have been listening. And this is how we resolve, you know, the regional and planning issues. What was it, 24%? There's a real, you know, our industry feels that being able to, or project delays are caused by, you know, regional and planning issues, and the fact that, you know, our government, our levels of government might not be talking to each other, and our projects aren't talking to each other. This element of listening and data capture and doing something with it is so important.
Rom, how do you think, I love both of the ideas, and I think, you know, going to community and showing them that you're not wasting their time, that you've actually taken the time to understand what has been said previously.
Yeah,
I think that kind of concept could really help with the likelihood that Sarah's identified of people coming late to the table for projects that are underway now. People saying, hey, I was busy during the pandemic, but I'm interested in this now and I have the time to engage. I want to understand what you've done and how you've dealt with the concerns that I have. I think that could be a really good foil for that particular situation.
yeah.
I also find myself wondering, do you think that seeing governments work well together and work quickly together during the pandemic has changed the game in terms of community expectations?
Absolutely. You know, in the project experience, I never thought that that expectation was there from our communities. Now we saw all of our governments interlink together. They work together really as seamlessly as possible. So we can actually see it happening. So that expectation there is there. The bar has been raised for us as engagement professionals and for us working on mega projects. You know, we need to, as the data says, we need to show that projects are beneficial. We will see communities impacted by not one mega project in their local communities. It could be upwards of that 2 to 3. That's huge for a community. So being able to take communities who have just come to the party along the process of this is what we heard, and these are the decisions that have been made in response to that is so important.
Yep. Perfect. So just prior to going to, we've got two excellent questions in the chat that I do want to answer. The takeout for you, for people in the public sector or for people with public sector clients, where that expectation is there now from communities that governments can and will listen, can and will act quickly. What do you think it's going to mean for those projects, and how can they get ahead of that new expectation?
We need to be more nimble. My biggest gripe has always been, well, we move at a glacial pace. Well, it's not only my gripe anymore. We have proven as a community that we can be nimble, we can move swiftly, we can change our approach to, it feels like basically anything. The pandemic blew everything out of the water. So our expectation now as a community and as industry professionals is that we really do need to lift the game with our projects to say, we need to work quicker, we need to be more nimble, we need to report back and provide that information back to our communities to say, this is what we've heard and this is what we've done about it. That second part, this is what we've done about it, is so important.
Perfect. Well, that's fantastic, Ron. Two great questions in the chat, and I do encourage people to get a few more questions in there. We have a couple of minutes left. Marissa from South Australia, thank you so much for your question. I think it's really important that we do get down to the specifics. So Marissa was asking whether or not we had any data in terms of the kilometre distance of projects. And I know, Sarah, when we were talking with Jonathan Cartledge from IA, that the measure there was a 5K radius when they were looking at projects in a community area. I would love you to have a bit more of an input on here. My take was that the projects that were considered local were within the jurisdiction of that community, so within that local government area.
Yeah, that's correct, Kirsty. That's right. And I'll put some answers there in the chat for Marissa and others who are interested in this. And it's wonderful we have these webinars, because you always challenge us as researchers to think about how we collect our data, and is there another way to do this? So maybe next time we'll do it relative to kilometres to your home. The Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure survey was done in collaboration with one of Australia's leading social research firms into measuring social license to operate. That's Vaconic. And their software allowed us to geolocate participants when they were responding to the survey. And so when they clicked where they were, they would receive a list of projects that were identified as being within that particular area. So for instance, we had Geelong as one of our regional centres that we studied. And so things like the Geelong downtown revitalisation and projects that are part of the Geelong City Plan were included in that list of projects. So we did it that way. So we do have a really good sense that all of the projects were within those local areas. And similarly, I have answered David's question in the chat, but that question about, do we have data in the Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure survey about perceptions or experiences that are different between private developers and government? And the answer is yes, we do. Not on a project by project basis, but certainly on that basis of private developers versus government. And that's something that's available in our Australian Perspectives on Infrastructure Highlights report. And I'm certain that we can include a copy of that, because it is now available in the follow-up to this webinar. Thanks, Kirsty.
That's perfect, Sarah. My recollection is that there wasn't an enormous difference between private sector developers and public sector developers, which was a little surprising, because you would think that potentially there's that little bit more residual goodwill toward a government agency, a little bit more residual trust than toward an organisation that might be perceived as in it for a profit. But that wasn't what came back in the data.
Yeah, look, it doesn't come out so much. What does come out in the data, and for those of you who are interested, we really encourage you to have a look. It's part of the reason why this year, when we launch the 5th State of Infrastructure and Engagement Survey, which we will do at NCIF in Brisbane in June, we are going to be focusing on politicization, because what we saw from the results was that the perceptions of private developers and government were pretty similar, but where community members are showing distrust and a bit of unhappiness is around their perceptions that projects within Australia are heavily politicized, particularly where those projects are used as and announceable. Indeed, approximately 59% of community members said that where a project is announced by a politician, their opportunity for genuine community engagement is substantially reduced. So I think that's where we're seeing that difference there.
Brilliant. Two more questions in the chat that I'd love to just quickly respond to before we close, one of which is a great throw to a next event. Marissa, you asked about timescale, and I can say that the projects that we included in the community-facing survey were projects that were either currently underway or very recently completed in the last couple of years. So that's what's come through in this particular lot of data, but certainly timing and approaches is a major research theme for us at the Institute. So looking at that longevity could definitely be a topic for future surveys. Richard Parsons, who comes to us with so much experience as a pioneer in social impact assessment, you have thrown perfectly to an event that we have coming up in late May, or two events actually in late May, one for partners and one for the wider industry, where we actually do want to target this relationship between social impact assessment and community engagement, because as we know, so often those teams are separate. You know, we will have a social impact assessment consultant prepare a report. There isn't necessarily fantastic cooperation or collaboration between those two teams. And indeed, in my experience, often you see community engagement teams completely isolated from the social impact assessment process. So what we're looking to do with that particular survey is to really understand what's happening for those two roles, and those events will be in the final week of May. We're looking to understand those two roles, looking to identify opportunities to better integrate the two functions so that we can actually really start from a very early stage to better manage the social impacts and indeed the social risks for projects. So thank you very much for the setup on that one. That was really terrific. Guys, we've had a really good discussion today. I am mindful of everyone's time. Sarah, Romilly, and Romina and Emerson, really appreciate your time and your insight. Participants, we will be sending out a link to the video from today if you have team members that you'd like to share this with. And equally, we will have a summary report coming back to you. So yeah, look forward to that and to your feedback on the data that we have to share. Thank you all so much for joining the discussion, and we'll see you at the next event.